We all think we know Anne Frank, but what if the version we carry with us has been carefully shaped, softened, and even rewritten over time? In The Many Lives of Anne Frank, Ruth Franklin explores the life of Anne Frank and how she went from being an ordinary teenager to becoming an icon through her diary that lived beyond her death. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Award-winning author Ruth Franklin's previous books include Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, and 1,000 Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Literature. She joins us to talk about The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Ruth, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you so much.
Well, before we talk about some specific information in this book, give us a brief overview. What are readers going to find here?
So my book is part a biography of Anne Frank and part a cultural history of the idea of Anne Frank as it's developed over the decades since her diary was first published and some of the controversies that have accompanied it on its journey.
So, as you just pointed out, you're not just talking about her story, although that is certainly there, but you're talking about how this image of her and the idea of her has been used and misused over time. So, let's first of all talk about what we know to be the facts here. Tell us a bit about her story that maybe most people may not be aware of.
Absolutely. Well, Anne Frank, as we all know, wrote, as a teenager in hiding during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands for just over 2 years with her family and their friends. During that time, she wrote a diary that went on, of course, to be published by her father, who was the only survivor of the 8 people who were in hiding in the annex, as the space is called, after they were betrayed to the Nazis, deported to concentration camps, and the 7 other people murdered. That's, of course, that is the outline of Anne's story. Now, the things that I think are much less commonly known, first of all, is Anne is often talked about as a Dutch Jew. But technically, she wasn't Dutch. Despite the fact that her family had lived in the Netherlands for many years, she was technically stateless as a refugee from Germany, where she was born. Her parents were from Frankfurt, which is where she grew up for the first few years of her life. They came to the Netherlands as refugees after Hitler came to power in 1934, in late 1933 and 1934. They gradually made their journey to the Netherlands. It was her dream, actually, to get Dutch citizenship, but she never achieved that during her lifetime. And then the second thing I'll say that is many people don't realize about Anne is that her diary, as we know it, is we could say that it's not technically a diary. It's more like a memoir in diary form because Anne herself rewrote the entire thing, starting again from the beginning, after she had the idea that it might find its way to an audience. And I can say more about that as our conversation goes on, if you wish.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about that. And also Otto Frank's role in the diary, because he had an interest in how that was presented as well. But tell us about, Anne's thoughts about the potential audience for her memoir.
Sure. So in March 1944, after the families had been in hiding for almost 2 years, they heard a minister from the Dutch government in exile speaking on the clandestine Dutch radio station, which was broadcast from London. And he asked Dutch citizens to save their documents from the war years for inclusion in a future national archive that he imagined creating. To give a full picture of what had happened to them during those years. And he said, which I think is quite poignant, he said, history can't be written on the basis of official documents alone. We must have the voices of private people, private citizens. And when the residents of the annex heard this, Anne writes that they all made a rush for her diary. They all knew that she had just such a document, just what he was talking about. But it's clear that over the next couple of months, as she looked over her diary, which she was in the habit of doing regularly, and we know this because she would sometimes leave notes to herself in the margins when she was coming back to a passage or an entry at a later date. As she was looking over her diary, it's clear that she realized that as she had written it, it didn't quite serve the purpose that would be necessary if it were going to be read by a larger audience. Because first of all, it was too personal. It was very much about, her interiority, her daydreams, her thoughts about her friends, even, gossip about her classmates. And it didn't have quite as much about the actual persecution of the Jews. And so she went back to the beginning. She rewrote it on, in a fresh copy and on fresh sheets of paper. And she took out a lot of the more personal things, some of which her father then put back in when he prepared the diary for publication. And she also added more details about what exactly they had been going through in those years. And we have a little clue to her thinking in that when she revised the entry in which she talks about hearing this minister from the government on the radio, in her rough draft, she wrote, wouldn't it be funny if in 10 years people were to learn what we talked about and thought about and what we ate here when we were in hiding? Which, of course, is exactly what she wrote about in the diary as we know it, which, anybody who read it knows. But then when she came back to that entry just a few months later and revised it, she wrote, wouldn't it be funny if we Jews were to tell how we lived and what we ate and so on in hiding? And she had made that leap from to understanding that the Jews needed to tell their own story, that nobody else could tell it in quite the same way. I find that so astounding, really, in terms of her perception and her wisdom about what it meant to be a witness to history in the way that she was.
We mentioned Otto Frank. Tell us a bit more about him and kind of what we know that maybe he was going through at the time he was preparing this for publication, because you noted that he put some things back in, so maybe he wanted people to know about who his daughter was as opposed to just what happened to her.
That's right. I think that's a wonderful way to put it. I think Otto's story is really fascinating. And, he's been in the narration of the publication of the diary, he's often been vilified by critics who describe him as Anne's censor. There's a common perception that he took out a lot of stuff that was important to her, that he softened her criticism of her mother, for instance, or her thoughts about her developing body. And what I found, I went over the different versions very, very carefully, comparing them to each other. And what I found is that is just not true. And that more often, Otto was restoring things that Anne herself had taken out. Including one of those things being her relationship with Peter Van Pels, which so many readers of the diary, remember as such a sweet moment, and it's something that really brightens the dark days that they spent in the annex. Now, Otto never talked about why he made the edits that he did to the diary during his lifetime. The variations, the different versions had not been published, so almost nobody knew about the details of how he had edited the diary. And I tried in my book. I feel quite sympathetic to Otto Frank, because many of us read the diary as teenagers or even younger, right? And it's a very powerful experience to read it as a teen. But I think it's even more powerful to come back to it as a parent, when you feel yourself to be. You can only imagine what it would be like to be in Otto Frank's position, to lose all the members of your family and have left only this remarkable document, which he then was so successful in bringing out into the world.
And as we talked about earlier, this book is not only about the real history of Anne Frank, as best you can piece that all together, but then there's this idealized version of Anne Frank that you see in movies and you see in other things. So tell us a little bit about kind of what we lose when she is kind of popularized and put up as an example that kind of on a pedestal that makes her somehow less human.
Sure. Yeah, Anne Frank has certainly become an icon, right? Her face is on billboards. It's instantly recognizable, to millions upon millions of people around the world. Her diary has been influential in ways that it's hard to quantify even. Um, and, from the beginning, from when it was first published, there was this tension around the diary from, whether it should be understood as a universal story about the dangers of prejudice in general, or a more specific story about about anti-Semitism and what had happened to the Jews during the Holocaust. And there is this push and pull in the diary's publication, in its reception, especially in America, where the initial marketing around the diary was people were quite reluctant to label Anne as a Jew. The publisher's marketing materials definitely de-emphasized her Judaism and played up her universality. Early reviews of the book emphasized that the Franks were just like any other people, that like your neighbors down the street, just like anyone else. And in fact, this was, in the beginning, this was what Otto Frank wanted. He did, I think in part, quite understandably, he felt anxious himself to be emphasizing Anne's Judaism and, of course, his own in these very fraught years right after World War II. And in fact, he ended up moving from Amsterdam to Basel, where he felt more comfortable. There's quite a lot of anti-Semitism in the Netherlands, even in those post-war years. And then on the other hand, it's clear from looking at Otto's letters that he understood what might be lost through pushing this universalist approach to the diary. And there's one letter he wrote to a writer named Meyer Levin, a Jewish American journalist who actually covered the liberation of the camp Buchenwald as a journalist in Europe in spring 1945, who very, very much wanted to be the person to adapt Anne's diary for Broadway and thus, bring it to an even greater audience. And from the beginning, it seems Otto was a little bit anxious about Meyer Levin's tendency to play up the Jewish aspects of the diary. And so he wrote this fascinating letter where he writes to Levin, he says, Anne's diary is not a Jewish book, so do not make a Jewish play out of it. And then in the same letter, he says, but on the other hand, it must be a Jewish play so that it can work against anti-Semitism. And so we feel this tension really, right from the start over, whether the diary is a book against prejudice in a larger sense, or if it ought to be understood as a book against anti-Semitism.
There's much more in this book than we have time to talk about. I'm curious about the impact that doing all of this research about Anne Frank has had on you. Has it changed your thoughts about her and her diary?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. From the beginning, when I first started working on this book, I had the idea that I wanted to write alongside her rather than over her. That I really wanted my own book, my biography, to be a kind of companion to her, rather than, a re-narration of her story. And so, my aim really is to provide a lot of context. I try to give a lot of information about what was going on around her. Things that she wasn't aware of at the time, but that affected the way the decisions that were made by the Nazis about what was going to happen to her, as well as obviously the complicated story of her legacy. And one thing that really stood out in the research is how many people who knew her as a child or, as a teenager before she went into hiding said that she seemed like any other, just an ordinary teenager. Her high school history teacher even published a poem in which one of the lines is, nobody saw anything unusual about her or anything special about her, maybe. And on the one hand, you think, wow, poor Anne Frank, she actually was this genius writer, and nobody knew it at the time. Even her father later said in interviews that it wasn't until he wrote the diary that he really felt he understood who his daughter was. And, at the same time, I think that says so much about what happened to her while she was in hiding. The annex really was a kind of crucible that accelerated her development into, the writerly voice that we know.
What new appreciation of Anne Frank do you hope readers will take from this book?
I hope that readers can appreciate something of the complexity of her life and who she was. I think, and along with her being elevated to an icon, that paradoxically, I think, results in flattening her out. And so all we may know of her voice is, maybe a couple of quotes from the diary, in a sense that she was a tragic victim. And what I hope to show in my book is that she was so much more than that, starting with this extraordinary revision of her diary in which she becomes the author of her own story, that it's so important to her to have that agency, to be this voice who is narrating a story, a crucial story of the persecution of the Dutch Jews. I think Anne's diary has become such a mainstay of global culture that we almost take it for granted. And, and we shouldn't. We should never lose sight of the fact that this, this fascinating, funny, devastating book was produced by a 15-year-old girl. And I think that's just extraordinary.
To learn more, the book is The Many Lives of Anne Frank by Ruth Franklin. Ruth, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it.
If you'd like to purchase The Many Lives of Anne Frank, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you appreciate this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.